Hi, today we will be reviewing Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind by Yuval Noah Harari. Sapiens is a rather sizable book, just coming in at over 400 pages. It's very interesting, actually. It's a good read. It was really easy to read. So basically the whole idea of the book is to give a history of humankind, starting with kind of around the Big Bang, and how different animals evolved, and how humans evolved, and how there were once at one point 6 different species of human, us being Homo sapien, the only remaining human. So it kind of started with us being able to stand up, because standing up makes it easier to see game and prey in a savanna or a grassland of some kind. So the book is split into 4 parts. There's part 1, the cognitive revolution; 2, the agricultural revolution; 3, the unification of humankind; and part 4, the scientific revolution. And it is in that order. So starting with the cognitive revolution, it kind of talks about how man kind of came out from the trees, started standing up. Homo sapien came out and kind of really quickly taken over the world, really quickly spread, and just our unique ability to imagine things, to create, scenes in our heads and be able to communicate those ideas to each other, which is something that no other animal can do. The agricultural revolution kind of explains how humans started, instead of going from camp to camp and migrating a lot, we started farming. We started planting crops, particularly wheat. And there's a lot of discussion that takes place in this book about how whether the hunter-gatherer lifestyle is better for us than the farming lifestyle. And there is some support to that, being that we probably enjoyed a more fulfilling day. We probably worked less hours, probably 30 to 35, hunting and gathering. We probably knew more about our immediate surroundings. We did know more about our immediate surroundings, about the world that we lived in, than we do now. And how we're kind of hardwired for hunter-gatherer societies. And so a lot of the way that our societies are built now stems from the hunter-gatherer kind of idea. So we started planting crops. Arguably, conditions for individual human beings got worse at this point. However, the survival of the species got better as we began to reproduce more and human population began exploding, even though the condition for a single human being was likely to be worse off once we started farming and living in camps. Also, with the creation of that is where a lot of war started coming from. Hunter-gatherers were rather peaceful, as far as we know, and the violence mostly came from argument over territory because of the farming land that was required to feed a certain population. So people got into, that was what most conflict was about, was for land. So then part 3 comes down to the unification of humankind, and between part 2 and part 3, it kind of talks about how the camps that created the agricultural revolution began to grow in population and seize more land and become bigger and bigger. And it kind of talks about how empires are formed this way, and how empires are probably the best way of organization for human government that we have so far. And talks about how a lot of what holds these empires together are our ability, Homo sapiens' ability to think in imaginative terms with each other. So, for instance, I can state something imaginative and you can also believe it too, such as a lot of what is wrote on paper, what constitutes law. So, for instance, marriage and home ownerships are nothing but pieces of paper, but it's that belief and the imaginary idea that gives us structure to our societies. So right here is a little paragraph that I'm going to read, and it's talking about how what is considered natural and unnatural, and kind of integrating culture into that. So culture tends to argue that it forbids only that which is unnatural, but from a biological perspective, nothing is unnatural. Whatever is possible is by definition also natural. A truly unnatural behavior, one that goes against the laws of nature, simply cannot exist, so it would need no prohibition. So anything that can be achieved, anything that's possible, anything you can do, anything you can think of, is natural, because it's occurring in our natural world. So then he goes on to kind of give some ideas on why human societies have formed the way they are, particularly why we are a patriarch, why men have taken control of the more social issues. And a lot of positions of leadership, we mostly have men, as many of you know. So here's another section of the book talking about giving different ideas about why it could possibly be this way. So we have these ideas on what it takes to run a good empire. And we usually justify men as running the empire because they are good at upholding these certain beliefs that we have of what makes a good empire. However, when you look at things, women are sometimes, if not more, just as good or better at doing these certain things. For instance, manipulation, appeasing others, and seeing themselves from the perspective of others. That's something good for a leader, but for some reason we still have less women. So the question on why it's a patriarch is still a little bit unanswered. It's still a little unknown, especially because when we look at chimps, they're also a patriarch like us, but when we look at bonobos, another cousin of ours, we see a matriarch. So we're not really sure. At present, we have no good answer. Maybe the common assumptions are just wrong. Maybe males of the species, Homo sapiens, are characterized not by physical strength, aggressiveness, and competitiveness, but rather by superior social skills and a greater tendency to cooperate. We just don't know. So we don't know. There's just some speculation on there. So then the book goes into part 3, the unification of humankind. And it kind of talks about how a lot of our empires began fighting other large empires, and the loser would just basically become part of the winner, making a bigger empire. And how over the course of history tends to go towards unification. It's trying to create a one, such as a one global empire or the like. Then a couple big paragraphs come up on money and how money can really unify, how money did unify humans and what money is. So first and foremost, it kind of talks a lot about the different various types of money over the course of history. That's fine. That's not hugely important. But what is important is it talks about what makes good money. And essentially what makes good money is the trust that we have that it can buy things. For instance, I know that if I have $10, I can buy something of $10 value. That whoever is selling that item will take my money. And that's the trust that we have. That's what allows money to work. It's hard to put a value on things when we have no medium of exchange. And the example in the book was an apple farmer who needs to get some, I believe it was shoes. And so he went to the shoe market, but the guy who was making the shoes didn't have any use for apples, even though the guy selling apples had the best apples in the land. So just because he didn't want the apples, the apple maker couldn't get any shoes. But with currency, they're both fine. They both trust that it works, because apple farmer can sell his apples to people who are searching for apples and receive money, and then take that money and pay the cobbler and get his shoes. Money is the most universal and most efficient system of natural trust ever devised. And so trust is really the currency, and money allows you to exchange basically anything into anything. So currency is good. And then he goes on to talk mostly about capitalism. There is some communism in here, but mostly capitalism. And the main idea of capitalism is that the profits of production will be reinvested into more production. And that idea will allow us to move forward and closer to prosperity. He kind of promotes capitalism, and he doesn't really touch much on communism. He says that there was really only one experiment on whether or not communism was good, and that was in the Soviet Union, and it failed miserably. And capitalism has succeeded over and over. And he also says that communism and capitalism are religions because they're ideologies rather than anything else. Those are the proper terms for those two ideologies, is religion, because it's a set of values, a set of beliefs that a large group of people follow, which is the same case in most religions and even government constitutions, if you will. So then he goes on to talk about the good guys and bad guys in history and who is who. And he really mentions kind of how most empires are built and then collapse, and empires fight other empires. That's just something they've all done. And so it's hard to label who is the good guy and who is the bad guy. Whatever path we take, the first step is to acknowledge the complexity of this dilemma and to accept that simplistically dividing the past into good guys and bad guys leads nowhere. Unless, of course, we are willing to admit that we usually follow the lead of the bad guys. And then he kind of mentions a similar idea in religion. There's monotheism and then polytheism. Monotheism, of course, being the belief in one God, and then the latter being the belief in many gods. And they have different issues. There is this issue between good and evil and order. And monotheism explains order, but is mystified by who is evil. Because if there's one God, how can there be evil? And that's really where the main question comes from, and kind of questions stem from that. Dualism or polytheism, who explains the concept of evil by assigning evil gods. For instance, Satan. And so dualism is the idea of two gods, really, or one God divided in himself. So think of God, Jesus, think of Jesus, and think of Satan. That's kind of, the one God divided into himself to create two. So there's Jesus and Satan, it's dualism. Dualism explains evil, but is mystified by order, kind of saying who to follow and whose viewpoints are better, kind of stuff like that. So he says here, monotheism explains order, but is mystified by evil. Dualism explains evil, but is puzzled by order. There is one logical way of solving the riddle, to argue that there is a single omnipotent God who created the entire universe, and he's evil. But nobody in history has had the stomach for such belief. I like the way he added that in the end there. But yeah, so it's kind of relating back to that religion, or the empire thing, is that we're usually, if we are to split good and bad into two different distinctives, two black and whites, then we'll see that over the course of history, people usually follow the lead of evil. And then he says kind of the same idea here. It comes into religions. We have a hard time identifying who is evil. So there is an entire paragraph on capitalism. And in that paragraph, he talks a lot about credit and its unique ability to kind of build the future. So money is trust in each other, and trust in goods and services, and trust in currency. Credit came about recently and was an idea to kind of allow people to trust in the future, because the future means more prosperity, more wealth to be accumulated. For example, the example used in the book was somebody who wanted to open a bakery but had no money. Well, she can go to the bank or somebody and get a loan to open the bakery, because they all both trust that in the future she'll be selling cakes and be making money and be able to repay that loan plus some and have some still for her. It's trust in the future, it's trust in the building of our culture, the building of our empire, and the creation of wealth. So then he talks about how politics and currency kind of affects each other. Ardent capitalists tend to argue that capital should be free to influence politics, but politics should not be allowed to influence capital. A government may oppose heavy taxation on industrials and use the money to give lavish unemployment benefits, which are popular with the voters. So what he's kind of saying here is that we should allow things in the market to affect politics, but we shouldn't allow politics to affect the market. And because when politics are able to affect the market, just one example, certain things can happen, such as buying votes. And when we start to buy votes, we start to elect leaders who aren't maybe the best leaders, but who are maybe just promising the most. And when we do that, we end up getting into this kind of loop of self-destruction almost, because we're promised things and maybe we don't receive those things, or maybe the cost of receiving those things far outweigh the benefits. There simply is no such thing as a market free of all political bias. The most important economic resource is trust in the future, and this resource is constantly threatened by thieves and charlatans. Markets by themselves offer no protection against fraud, theft, and violence. It is the job of political systems to ensure trust by legislating sanctions against cheats and to establish and support political forces, courts, and jails which will enforce the law. And I kind of agree with this reasoning here on this page. A lot of it's just saying that the politicians and our government's main job should be kind of regulating the market, and regulating the market by ensuring trust and cutting down on thievery, on stealing, and on breaking that trust, just to kind of reinforce the value of the dollar, if you will. He begins to talk about energy and energy production and energy consumption. He doesn't talk about this very much. Clearly the world does not lack energy. All we lack is the knowledge necessary to harness and convert it to our needs. And just that as society grows, we use more and more energy. Energy is kind of a recent phenomenon. And since the discovery of electricity and putting it to use, we have basically created a world where we cannot imagine our lives for more than a week without electricity. Just real quick, he says that a strong desire to play, which is something in all mammalian animals, is just the way of learning social behavior for the young, which I kind of agree with, kind of disagree with. I think there is, and it's hard to see this as a human, but I think playing is something good because we continue to play as adults. We never really grow up, we just learn how to act in public. Playing is something that we always do. At the end of this chapter on capitalism, he talks about capitalism as religion. And this ethic promises paradise on a condition that the rich remain greedy and spend their time making more money, and that the massives give free rein to their cravings and passions, such as consumerism, shopping, buying, and buy more and more. This is the first religion in history whose followers actually do what they are asked to do. Because, for example, let's just take Christianity as an example. Humans aren't particularly well at following the Ten Commandments all the time. We sin, we make mistakes, it's what we do. However, this capitalist, consumeristic ideal is the first religion in order that has attained where the followers actually do what they're supposed to do, which is buy. So then he goes on to talk about the collapse of the family unit and the emergence of a strong market and strong individuals. So for a long time, from hunter-gatherers to up until probably very recently, the family has been the basic unit of society. Whatever the family did kind of controlled society, and families worked together, stayed together, lived together, operated together. So if somebody in the family needed something, the family would chip in and help. However, recently, this has gone away, and we've replaced the family with the market and state. Because now, when you want something and your family isn't able to provide for you, you're able to go to the market. For example, if you want to start a business, your family would usually give you the money or help you raise the money. However, now, if you want to start a business and need the money, you're able to go to the market and get a loan. So the strong state market tends to lead to strong individuals because we focus more on ourselves and our relationships with the state rather than ourselves and our relationship with the families. It talks about how a strong family means a weak state and weak individuals. I'm not entirely sure about the weak individual part. I could see that there being a strong family and strong individuals, but I think he's saying for the most part, for the masses, weak individuals come about from strong families, and then strong individuals come about from strong markets in states. So government over that market, essentially. Which, I mean, it would make sense because the stronger the individual, the more, maybe perhaps the stronger the society that you're part of. Because even though the family would be the basic unit, a strong individual who is kind of forced to become strong on his own and then only look to the market for help, which, as we know, the market isn't always lenient, I guess. I could see an individual becoming stronger as a process of that, but I can also see an individual becoming stronger from a strong family, because that would make sense, right? So towards the end of the book, right before wrapping everything up, he talks about this argument of happiness and whether or not humans today are happier than they were, how many years ago? 100, 500, 1,000, all the way back to the beginning. Has our happiness improved? Because our amount of humans in the world have improved, but has our happiness improved? Is this all worth it? Is what we're doing right? Well, it's kind of hard, and it's a complex argument because, first of all, happiness, the definition of happiness, isn't something we agree on. So he goes forth to set a definition in his book and then kind of talks towards that definition. So the generally accepted definition of happiness is subjective well-being. Happiness, according to this view, is something I feel inside myself, a sense of either immediate pleasure or long-term contentment with the way life is going. He says right here, when things improve, expectations balloon, and consequently, even dramatic improvements in objective conditions can leave us dissatisfied. We kind of acclimate to our pleasures and stop feeling pleasure. So then he goes on to talk about what it's called chemical happiness, and how we kind of are at base zero, and some things happen that make us sad, and some things happen that make us happy. But whatever happens, we return to our base zero. So arguably, we have not gotten happier over time. And then he talks about how hunter-gatherers probably achieved that happier feeling more often because they were doing things in their daily routines that they were biologically evolutionized to do, which would be, he says specifically that there's probably nothing in our society today that equates to the happiness that a group of men felt when hunting down a mammoth successfully. And then he also kind of talks about how the experience of pleasure isn't something that is mystical. The only thing that we're actually doing is reacting to chemical reactions in our body. specifically those of serotonin, dopamine, and oxytocin. I don't know how to say it. So people are made happy by one thing and one thing only, and that's pleasant sensations in their bodies. However, the pleasant sensations in our bodies, those chemicals remain relatively constant, which kind of just supports the idea I was just talking about, that we remain at a base zero and go in one direction or the other for only a small portion of time. So then he gives two good sections of the book that I enjoyed, and they're called The Meaning of Life and Know Thyself. So they're pretty good. The main idea of the meaning of life, there is no meaning to anything, and any meaning given is just a delusion. So he kind of says that meaningfulness is a delusion, and there is really no meaning. That's sort of his argument in here. And he says it's a quite depressing conclusion. So he goes on to talk about other things, such as the paragraph "Know Thyself," and he gives a bunch of different religions and examples of people teaching to know thyself for a while. And in doing so, he enters kind of the Buddhist ideology. The root of suffering is this never-ending and pointless pursuit of ephemeral feelings, which causes a constant state of tension, restlessness, and dissatisfaction. So it's kind of the pursuit of all that you want, all that you desire. It's the pursuit part. The pain comes from the pursuit. So people are liberated from suffering when they experience this or that fleeting pleasure, but rather when they understand the imperfect nature of all their feelings and stop craving them, they will be released from their pain. And this is the Buddhist ideology, that once we realize that everything that we desire is nothing more than just a feeling coming from our emotions, and set that desire aside and realize that it's the source of our pain, we're able to enjoy the world in a happy state. Think of a Buddhist or a guy who's standing on the ocean and the waves go out, and he enjoys when the wave goes out because they're good waves, and then when the waves come in, he fights them, tries to push them back because they're bad waves. Well, he realizes that he's struggling and only enjoying the good, so what he does is just goes and sits out on the beach and allows the waves to come in and out as they please. So the book wraps up with chapter 20, the End of Sapiens. So the big idea is that humans are breaking the law of natural selection, and we are incorporating the law of intelligent design. As we mess with DNA, as we clone things, as we change them, we made a rabbit that can glow like a jellyfish by taking jellyfish DNA, bioluminescence, and putting it into a rabbit. And the rabbit was born and can glow green. We are shaping the animals around us now according to our own desires and thoughts, which is kind of designing them intellectually. He says that when you look around yourself, you look at the animals that were not intelligently designed, which some of you may disagree with. He talks about bionic life and cyborgs. He talks about our destiny as humans, whether or not we'll become controlled by an AI who controls all the governing processes and the imaginative stories that humans align themselves with, or whether we'll become cyborgs where we create bionic limbs when we lose them, or maybe just add them, or maybe even something, the very last idea, maybe it wasn't very last, but the last idea is putting a chip in your skull and being able to access the internet from your brain and being able to access other people around you with your brain, which is kind of like Neuralink by Elon Musk. And then he just kind of makes the relation between humans and gods and whether or not we are gods, and our abilities to become immortal, which is not immortal saying that we can't die, but immortal meaning that we'll never deteriorate into death. We'll still die from accidents such as a car crash or something. But as long as natural shutdown, we can handle that by just replacing our body parts with bionic body parts and continuing to live in the future. So yeah, that's Sapiens. I give this book a 6 out of 7. It was very well wrote. I enjoyed the examples. I enjoyed going down some of the rabbit holes that went on. There wasn't really a lot wrong with this book. There are a few things, of course, that could be improved here or there, but I think there's no such thing as a perfect book. So yeah, I do suggest this book. It was very interesting to read. It was fun to read. It took me a while. Like I said, there's just over 400 pages. There's 416 if you don't read the Q&A with the author. So thanks for watching. Go ahead and hit the like button below, and yeah, pick yourself up a copy of Sapiens. Thanks.